Just like component annotation, which is going to help us to create the beans, very similarly, there are other stereotype annotations also available inside Spring. These are at service, at repository, and at controller annotations. Before I try to explain you about the stereotype annotations inside Spring Framework, first let me give a background on how a typical Java backend application is going to be developed. Any Java backend web application, even before the invention of Spring Framework, developers they used to develop this backend application by maintaining their code at multiple layers. If you consider this entire box as an web application, which is built with the help of Java programming language, inside this web application, we are going to have majorly three different layers. The very first layer is controller layer, or in other words, we can call this as presentation layer. You can assume each layer as a Java package or a set of Java packages where a developer is going to define all the class that are responsible to handle a layer like controller or presentation layer. Each layer has certain roles and responsibilities. Let's try to understand what are those. When a client application like browser or a mobile application or any front-end UI application send a request to the back-end application, it is going to be received by the controller or presentation layer. The primary responsibility of this layer is to receive the request from the client, followed by it needs to call the service layer, which is the next layer inside the web application. Once the response is received from the service layer, the controller layer need to send the response to the client application in the form of JSON or XML or in the form of HTML pages as well. Based upon the type of the web application you're trying to build, accordingly, your controller layer is going to return the response. After the controller layer, we have business layer or business logic layer. Inside this business logic layer only, the developers, they're going to define all their business logic, business rules, validations, or any transformations of the data. Once all the business logic is executed, from this layer only, the next layer is going to be invoked, which is the repository layer. Apart from invoking the next layer and handling the business logic, this layer is also responsible to handle the transaction management. Inside Spring Framework, we have an annotation with the name transactional. Using this annotation, we can control the rollbacks of the transactions, committing of the transactions. We're going to talk more details about this annotation in the coming lectures. For now, please note, this service layer is responsible to perform the transaction management as well. After the service layer, we have the repository layer or the data access layer. This layer is responsible to interact with the database and fetch the data or store the data. As I highlighted here, this layer is responsible to perform the CRUD operations on the database. CRUD means create, read, update, and delete operations. How this layer is going to interact with the database? It is going to leverage the frameworks or libraries like Spring Data JPA, JDBC to interact with the databases. Once the connection is established with the database, it is going to execute some SQL queries by either using native SQL queries or the JPQL queries. In the coming sections, we are going to explore what is Spring Data JPA, what are these JPQL, JDBC, native SQL, everything we are going to explore. For now, please note that this layer is responsible to interact with the database and perform the CRUD operations. If you closely observe, these are the three important layers that usually developers are going to follow while building a backend application. Apart from this layer, there can be some other optional layers like exception layer, which is going to handle all the exceptions inside your application. There will be model layer where you're going to maintain all the model classes or entity classes representing database tables. Similarly, there will be DTO layer, which means data transfer object layer. Inside this DTO layer, we are going to maintain all the DTO objects which are responsible to transfer the data from UI application to the backend application and from the backend application to the UI application. We're going to build all these layers inside this course. But for now, the reason why I'm trying to highlight these three important layers is around these three important layers only, the stereotype annotations are developed inside the Spring framework. In the previous lecture, we explored about the component annotation. This annotation is a generic annotation that can be used on top of any Java class. Apart from this generic annotation, there are other specialized stereotype annotations which are built by extending these component annotation. For example, controller is an stereotype annotation which you can mention on top of the Java classes that you defined inside the controller layer only. That is the standard that you need to follow. Of course, instead of this controller layer, you can mention this component annotation or any of these annotations. Still, your Java class is going to be converted as a bean by the Spring Framework. Spring Framework will never going to complain that you have used controller annotation in some other layer. It is just a standard that is established by the Spring Framework. The same we need to follow. So where do we need to use this controller annotation? On top of all the Java classes which you are trying to convert as a beans from your controller or presentation layer. Usually we mention these annotation on top of the classes which are responsible to handle the incoming web request inside an Spring MVC based application. In case if you are looking to build the REST APIs which are going to be invoked by an UI application to invoke the logic on the backend, in such scenarios, we can use a specialized annotation of controller, which is @REST controller. When you use @REST controller annotation on top of a Java class, it is going to return the response in the form of JSON to the client application. Whereas when you implement the controller annotation on top of a class, the response is expected to be sent as an HTML page so that this HTML page can be displayed on the UI page. Based upon our requirements, whether we are trying to build a REST API based backend application or an MVC based application, accordingly, we need to use either of these annotations. We are going to use these annotations a lot throughout this course. For now, just be clear about the purpose of these annotations. I'll show you the demos and examples throughout this course. After controller stereotype annotation, we have the service annotation as well. This annotation we need to use on top of the classes that we have written inside the service layer. Service layer is responsible to implement the business logic. So wherever you're writing all your actual business logic on top of such classes, you need to mention this annotation to convert them as a beans. At last, we have the repository stereotype annotation. This annotation we need to mention on top of the classes which are responsible to interact with the database. All such classes, we are going to define them inside the data access layer or inside the repository layer. Such classes should be marked with the repository annotation to create them as Spring beans. When we are using any of these stereotype annotations inside our backend application, we should also use component scan annotation. We already saw what is the purpose of these annotation in the previous lecture. This annotation, it is going to enable the automatic scanning of these annotations. So we just have to provide the package details where all these annotations are used. Accordingly, Spring Framework is going to scan them and create the beans. Let me open the component annotation file. Inside my IntelliJ, I'm going to press the shortcut Command O and search for component. So please open the component interface file present inside the package org.springframework.stereotype. In case if you are not able to see all these comments and source code, as I said before, you need to select these download sources and documentation option, which is going to download all the source code and documentation of the libraries and frameworks that you're trying to use with the help of Maven pom.xml. If you see, this is an interface. Usually all the annotations, they are going to be annotated as interface only. This annotation, it is also going to support a value attribute. For example, here on top of the vehicle, we are trying to use a component annotation. If I'm looking to provide my own custom name to the bean that is going to be created by the Spring Framework, here I can try to start the parentheses and use value. And to this value, I can try to mention what is the name that I want to consider for the bean that is going to be created by the Spring Framework. Otherwise, you can directly also mention the bean name within the double quotes. So these are the possible options that you can explore. Let me roll back to normal component only. Inside this component, you can read this entire documentation to know more details. But the important information that I want to highlight here is all the stereotype annotations like service, controller, and repository, they built on top of these component annotation. For example, if I open any of these stereotype annotations like service, on top of this file name, you'll be able to see there is a at component bean annotation is already defined, which means when you are using this service annotation, you are indirectly using this component annotation only. The service annotation or repository annotation or controller annotation, they are only created as standards that developers needs to follow to mention these annotation on top of a Java class based upon which layer a given class is present. I hope you're clear with all these stereotype annotations. I'm not going to show you any demo around these service, repository, and control annotations because once we start discussing about the Spring Boot and start developing a web application with the help of Spring Boot, we're going to use these annotations at many places. Inside your Spring related interviews, people may ask you about what are stereotype annotations, what are different type of stereotype annotations available, when we should use them, what is the differences between them. All these kind of questions you should be able to answer if you understand the concepts that we have discussed inside this lecture.